Hey, welcome to our daily brief. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden patterns of control that can secretly guide everything from the stock market to entire national economies. We'll see how some perfectly timed news can look an awful lot like market manipulation, and then we'll see how that same exact desire for influence plays out at the highest levels of politics. All right, let's dive in.
So let's start with a really big question, one that was on every trader's mind. Was the S&P 500, one of the most important market indexes in the world, was it deliberately manipulated? To figure that out, we have to follow the evidence, and that trail begins at the scene of the crime.
So, where do we even begin? Well, like any good mystery, you start at the scene. And in this case, the scene wasn't a place, it was two very specific price levels on the S&P 500 futures chart. Think of them as invisible walls that set the stage for this entire event.
Okay, let's get specific. The market had what we call a support floor down at 63.61. This was a price that, for whatever reason, it just had a really hard time falling below. And then at the top, it had a resistance ceiling at 64.70 that it couldn't seem to punch through. For a while, the market was just kind of stuck, bouncing between these 2 points. Now, you're going to want to remember these two numbers. They are the key to everything that happens next.
All right, now this is where the timing starts to feel, well, a little too perfect. Just as the S&P 500 was drifting down towards that 63-61 floor, boom, a news story suddenly breaks. Iran is threatening to attack U.S. companies. So what happens? The market does exactly what you'd expect. It panics. The price crashes right through that support floor, which triggers this wave of automatic selling. But then, and this is the crazy part, almost instantly it whips right back around and shoots back up above the floor.
Now, a move like that actually has a name. It's called a false downward breakout. And for experienced traders, seeing this pattern is like finding a footprint at a crime scene. It's a huge clue. It often suggests that large institutional investors, what people call the strong hands, use the panic from that news story to scoop up a ton of assets on the cheap, which is what caused that lightning-fast recovery. In the markets, very few things are really a coincidence.
And after that footprint was left at the bottom, the market didn't just go back to normal. It started to climb, a nice steady climb. And guess where it was headed? Yep, straight for that second number we talked about, the resistance ceiling up at 64.70. This whole thing was just setting the stage for Act 2 of the story. And this is where the pattern just becomes undeniable. Just as the S&P 500 comes right up to that resistance ceiling, what happens? Another news alert flashes across the screen, and this time, Iran announces it's ready for peace talks, the absolute perfect piece of good news to counteract the first story. Of course, the market surges with optimism and smashes right through that resistance level. So two critical price levels, two perfectly timed opposite news events. Coincidence? You tell me.
So this apparent desire to control the board, right, to steer outcomes with these perfectly timed moves, it turns out that's not something you only see in the financial markets. In fact, we see a remarkably similar pattern playing out in the high-stakes world of politics and central banking.
And what's really fascinating here is that this tactic crosses all political lines. It's not a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing, it's a power thing. On completely opposite ends of the political spectrum, we see the exact same play. In the US, you might have a conservative leader publicly criticizing the head of the Federal Reserve. Meanwhile, in Colombia, a leftist president is doing the very same thing to the head of his country's central bank. Their politics couldn't be more different, but their goal? It's identical. Pressure an independent institution to bend to their political agenda.
Now, we're not talking about some subtle behind-the-scenes pressure either. I mean, just look at this direct quote from Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro. He's basically saying out loud how frustrated he is that the head of his central bank is acting independently instead of just helping him out. This is pretty much the political equivalent of trying to force the market past a resistance level.
So, you might be asking, why all the drama? Well, this chart really tells the whole story. The Colombian government spending is growing at a 10% clip, but its tax revenue is only growing at 4%. That creates a huge deficit. The president wants the central bank to keep interest rates low to make borrowing money cheaper for the government. But the central bank governor, he's worried about inflation, so he wants to raise rates. It's this classic conflict between short-term political goals and long-term economic stability. So let's bring it all together. What we've really seen here are two sides of the very same coin. On one side, you have these incredibly well-timed news releases that look like they're designed to steer a market past key hurdles. And on the other, you have public pressure campaigns designed to steer an economy for political gain. In both cases, powerful players leave behind these predictable patterns, these footprints that reveal their ultimate goal. And what is that goal? It's always the same: control. And that really leaves us with one big question, doesn't it? We've seen how these patterns can hide in plain sight. You just have to know what to look for. So, in a world that's just full of noise, it makes you wonder if the people in power are always leaving these footprints. Are we looking closely enough to see where they're trying to lead us?